we are going to move into a session on education. Of course, any of us, I know as a parent, education of the kids in my house has been pretty disrupted over the last couple of years. Many people are going through changes and challenges. It's always a fascinating topic here at a university. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to the moderator for this session, Professor Eva Collins, another member of the Waikato Management School team. Eva, we're in your hands.
Thanks, Matt. Tēnā koutou katoa. As Matt said, this forum is being hosted by an educational institution, so you can imagine the interest in what this next panel has to say. Keeping to the now familiar format, after introducing the panel and giving them a chance to make some opening comments, we'll take questions from Slido, and also we're letting and encouraging the panelists to ask each other questions. We have until 2:30 to explore educational issues in COVID. So on to our panel. Our panel includes Alex Fernandes de Oliveira, Chief Investment Officer at the International Finance Corporation, Professor Don Klinger, Pro Vice-Chancellor, Division of Education, University of Waikato, and Dr. Michael Johnston, Senior Fellow at the New Zealand Initiative and Senior Lecturer in Education at Victoria University of Wellington. So over to you, Alex, to get us started.
Thank you, Eva. And first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity and the invitation. It's my first time attending the forum. A little disappointed that we're not in person in Hamilton, but hopefully for the next one. I thought I'd use these initial minutes to talk a little bit about IFC. I realize that many people in attendance might not be familiar with whom we are and what we do. Talk a little bit about my role at IFC, and then sort of leave a high-level message that is hopefully useful in starting the panel discussion. So IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. We share the same development objectives as the World Bank itself, but we work exclusively with private sector. So all of the investments we make, all of the projects we engage with are driven by private sector, no government interference. We are active across a whole range of industries. Our last fiscal year, we did about $30 billion worth of investments, and we do sort of a full range of financial investments, from senior loans to straight equity. And I think the other feature is, or two important features. One is we only work in emerging markets. So we work with companies from all over the world, but the projects they are investing in have to be in emerging markets. And the second angle, we are a development institution. So way before sort of the concept of impact investing was developed, we had already been doing it. So all of our investments, we have to justify the financial return, but also some measure of broader good to the economy, to a society, a particular country. That's sort of part of our role. I lead our health and education investments across Asia. The theme that binds health and education together is, for us, development of human capital. Our view is countries cannot develop unless they're able to accumulate human capital. And health and education are both critical pillars in stimulating, helping countries, I guess, develop human capital. We do, in education, which is this afternoon's topic, we have today a portfolio of about $1 billion, most of it out to higher education institutions. That's been typically our focus, more than primary and secondary education, although we have invested in primary and secondary education schools. Fairly well diversified portfolio, significant in Latin America, significant in Asia, but also Middle East and in Africa. So a fairly balanced, geographically very balanced education portfolio. And I think the key sort of message, as I mentioned, we work with private sector. And in emerging markets, what we have seen, I think our experience has been that the private sector actually contributes quite a bit to strengthening local education systems. At one level, it's just the sheer additional resources. Fiscal situation in many of the countries we work in is challenging. COVID has not helped. And private sector, brings additional resources which tend to strengthen education systems in these countries. I think the other angle is, I would say, if I had to summarize our strategy for investing in education, in private education in emerging markets, we're trying to support institutions that provide relevant education and typically help young people obtain relevant jobs. I think that is at the core what we see as sort of our strategy, what we see as our objective. Help especially young people develop the skills that are relevant in the job market, and as a result, obtain relevant employment. And I think in our experience, private sector plays an important role establishing, I would say, better links to labor markets, tailoring education that is more relevant to the job market. And as a result, I would say helps this transition from school to the workplace. We don't see it as one or the other. It's not public versus private. Our experience has been, I would say, that private sector complements very well in many of the countries we work in, sort of public sector efforts in promoting education. That was a lot. I hope it was clear, but I'll stop here in terms of opening remarks and pass it over to the panel.
Thank you, Alex. That was very clear and helpful to hear about IFC's role and your discussion about the opportunity for private sector investment in education. Let's now turn it over to Don for his opening comments. Don.
Tēnā koutou katoa. And as Eva mentioned, I'm Professor Don Klinger. I'm the PVC for Te Wānanga Toi Tangata Division of Education at the University of Waikato. You may have also quickly surmised that my own story did not begin in New Zealand. Prior to coming to the University of Waikato, I was in Canada with experience as an educator and an academic researcher in the field of educational measurement. I've long been interested in the uses and misuses of large-scale testing and also the factors that impact student success. And I've looked at, however we define success. I mean, I think there's lots of ways we can talk about what success really looks like. I think what you'll see from the panelists, I mean, there's a lot we agree on. And, I've actually done some work with the Aga Khan Foundation, which is also a private organization that funds educational initiatives. So we've worked as a panel to try to really highlight where we're coming at this from different perspectives. So with that, what I'm going to talk about here is my central argument is that the challenges of COVID and what its impact has been on education is the solution to it has to be in the ways we support and help public education. I don't think the solutions are going to be in the private sector the same way that the other panelists are going to talk about. Now, before you dismiss me as just another one of those left-wing socialists that has no understanding of finances or economics, please know I've long argued that education does have to be more like a business. Too often, educators talk about, they're different than business. They don't have to worry about finances. I've never bought into that argument. We are a resource-intense industry, and therefore we have responsibility to really think about how we use those resources effectively. I have a background in finance and business. I also worked in a school system where we had school-based decision-making. And so I saw when schools can become what I call resource pits, and we just can't have that. So as I said, I've always had that position. I used to get in big debates with colleagues around this whole position, around, our schools a business? I would argue they're not a business, but they have to be business-like, as I've just said. Where I do struggle with some of the economic philosophies in education is when it's centered around the notion of competitive structure rather than of what I would call a fundamental social responsibility framework. And I think this is where I'm going to push some of my work. And I'll talk about this from the work I do on statistical modeling in education. And over the past several years, I've really looked at, models of educational outcomes, what predicts them, what are the things that seem to impact student achievement or student outcomes, whether it be health and well-being, physical education, belongingness, all sorts of issues, success outcomes like that. And what I've been telling people, and I've said this a lot, if you want to see the best education system in the world, go to the USA. Just look to the US. There's a reason the US has got more Nobel Prize winners than the next 6 countries combined. At the same time, I've also said, if you want to see the worst education in the world, go to the US. The US is a really strong model. It's a competitive model where you have massive educational equities. And so the work I do is called HLM, hierarchical linear modeling. And if you can see, what we typically see is the US has a growth curve like this. The top performing schools are right up top, and the lower performing schools are quite low. There's a big difference. In the US, the schools that you go to really matter on your educational outcomes. Now, in contrast to that, we look at countries such as Finland and Canada, and they have very high educational standards. They do extremely well on PISA assessment and any of the other kind of assessments that are out there. But you also find much greater equity. So if I show the graph like the US is there, the graph for Canada is basically like that. Now what you will see is that in Canada, the peak is typically not as high. We just don't have the same high top-end schools that the US has. We have 1 or 2. But what we don't have are big differences at the bottom. In fact, in Canada, and the same in Finland, the school you go to doesn't really matter. You'll get a high-quality education in whichever school you go to. Now, there are issues that we talk about in Canada about raising that bar so that you do get everything higher. And the reason I talk about this is the second reason. Both Canada and Finland do not have a large private school system. They're very much a public system. Now, statistically, Aotearoa, New Zealand, looks more like the US than either Canada or Finland. Now, I'm painting I don't want to say an artificial picture, but I'm highlighting some big differences. But I have to be open and honest here. Even in Canada and Finland, there's massive inequities. Regardless of the educational outcomes we measure, there's a large proportion of students who are not meeting the standards we want for children. They feel they don't belong, their academic achievement is below, their connectedness to school is missing. So we get between about 15 and 30% of our children just don't feel connected to schools or don't succeed. It's, like I said, it's less in Canada, but it's still there. Now, it's these inequities are not random. They're systemic. We see them across certain population groups and certain communities and regions. You can imagine some of them already, if you think about New Zealand itself. And I think it's not hard to argue that COVID and its long tail will really likely exacerbate these existing inequities. There's a long list of factors that contribute to these inequities under COVID: teacher readiness and their own skills in dealing with online learning, home learning resources that children have access to, whether it be books, computers, iPads, Chromebooks, broadband, internet, dedicated learning spaces, either in the community or in the home, family and community supports, I mean, many of us here, we're well versed in how to support our children under a number of different challenging circumstances. That's not equally distributed across our populations. And these are all critical factors, but also they're ones that are largely out of the control of the students themselves. It's not their fault. And yet they're the ones that have to struggle with the implications of these inequities. So what I'm arguing is we have to differentially distribute resources to our schools in order to address these inequities, especially as a result of COVID. And this is where the competitive education models are really challenging. These models tend to reward prior success. And it's a classic case of the rich get richer. Not a bad model for businesses, perhaps, but it's not really a strong model in education. What we actually need to do is to direct the resources in research-supported professional learning as well to those educators in the public system who are best situated to address these inequities. Where are the problems? How do we get support into those schools, into those communities? We already have evidence that this kind of model works. The province of Ontario in Canada did use something called the OFIP project. It was called the Ontario Focused Intervention Partnership. And what they did is they identified the lowest performing schools and they directed research-based professional learning to their teaching staff and other resources in the community to support the performance of students, in this case in literacy and numeracy, on critical outcomes in those areas. And as a result, what they found was that those schools that, and it wasn't universal by any means, this is not a simple solution, but what they did find that in many of those schools, they were able to move themselves well out of that bottom, what they call quartile range into the, they still weren't above average, but they were moving up towards average performing schools. And I think this is the same kind of structure we have to think about as we deal with the COVID tail. We've got 15 to 30% of our students that are really going to struggle. And these are the ones that are going to have the biggest challenges catching up and meeting the standards we need for employment and future education. So there's my quick overview. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. And what I like about a panel, and particularly an afternoon panel, is one that represents a broad range of perspectives on the important issues. So, Don, I appreciate the view that was quite different from what Alex just presented. Our final speaker in the panel is Michael. So over to you, Michael, for your comments.
Thank you very much, Ava. I'm really going to, I think, build largely on what Don has said. And on the issue of public sector and private sector involvement in education, I probably sit somewhere between the first two speakers. I certainly take on board Don's point about the risks of a system which has a private sector within the public domain exacerbating educational inequality. I saw it in action when I was at University of Melbourne lecturing there nearly 20 years ago. Most of the students who got into that university were private school educated, and certainly the private sector is much more involved in education there than it is in New Zealand. And in general, I would like to see a public school system that is well funded and that does a good job of teaching children what they need to thrive in the world. I think if it's working well, it's a very good way of overcoming intergenerational poverty. However, there is the crux of it. Is it working well? Is it delivering those outcomes? And at the moment, there's a great deal of evidence in New Zealand that our system is not. As Don said, we resemble the American system in some ways, and that is a very large gap between the students who are doing the best and the students who are doing the poorest. We have some large socioeconomic and ethnic gaps in our educational data, and this is something that ought to concern us. And as Don also said, this inequity has its sources beyond the control the students themselves, but also, in fact, beyond the direct control of schools a lot of the time. There's socioeconomic factors that play into things. And as Don also said, I think that it's almost inevitable that the COVID lockdowns will have exacerbated educational inequality for almost obvious reasons. Despite the fact that we haven't seen any hard data on it yet, I think that's going to turn out to be so. So what can we do about it? Well, one thing, that we need to be aware of, and where I think the private sector may keep the public sector honest to an extent, is in the provision of high quality teaching and learning. So if the public school system can provide teaching and learning of equal quality to what you can get in a private school, why would anybody spend $25,000 a year to use a private school? Well, maybe for snob reasons, but not many people, have so much money they can afford to spend it on that. So if we can equip the public school system with what it needs to do as well as those private schools, then there shouldn't be an issue. And to that extent, I think it's good that there are private schools there as an element of competition, if you will, so that we can measure something against what the public schools are capable of. So there are some problems in the system, and they're not all related to money. That's the thing. We could spend a huge amount of money on the public school system and have better teacher-student ratios and better resources, and these wouldn't be a bad thing. But however, there's some things that we can do that are not going to cost all that much in comparison that could improve things markedly. And a lot of that has to do with just following evidence. So I think, for one thing, we need to look at what is taught in schools. So I'm quite a fan of the critical realist educational school of thought, which perhaps the biggest thinker in the world was Michael F.D. Young, who's a British educational philosopher and sociologist. And he had an insight that really what we need to do to overcome a lot of the socioeconomic inequality that affects education is to make sure that all students, but especially those from disadvantaged communities, have access to powerful knowledge. And powerful knowledge, he said, are things like mathematics and science and literacy, and as well, things like English and history. So the disciplines of our cultures that ground us in where we've come from, and also in what we need to do to test ideas. So things like science, for example, obviously is about testing ideas using evidence. And these are the things that I think we need to emphasize as coherent bodies of knowledge. And we can get into perhaps in question time where some of that is lacking. But the other thing that we need to focus on is the pedagogy, the teaching itself, and make sure that we're doing it in the most effective possible way. And at the moment, we're just not. There is at least 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, for which we've been teaching literacy in a way that really doesn't work optimally well, in spite of having an enormous amount of evidence from cognitive psychology and related disciplines about how to teach reading effectively. And that creates these socioeconomic gaps in learners, because those who have home resources will still do all right, but those who really need the sound science of learning behind the pedagogy they experience in schools will often struggle. So that may be a good place to conclude my opening remarks, and we can start to have some discussion.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. So each of you touched on this topic, and looking through the Slido questions, it's the one that comes up most of all, and I encourage participants to keep those questions coming through. The worry that I'm seeing through the questions is about the exacerbation of inequalities. through COVID, especially for our most vulnerable. So, Michael, you said something a little controversial there about it takes more than money. But I'd like to just unpack this a little bit more from each of you about how are we going to address these growing inequalities?
Shall I comment there? Yeah, so I mean, it will take some money. It takes money to do just about anything, of course. But I don't think it takes the sort of massive resources that parents put into private schools, say, when they buy a place for their child in a private school. It takes a Ministry of Education that will use an evidence-based approach to advice to teachers. It takes faculties of education who will train teachers according to that advice and according to the evidence. And that actually, doesn't cost very much at all. It's just a change of tack in terms of how we approach preparing teachers to teach and what actually happens in schools when we teach things like literacy and numeracy. So that's why I say that it needn't be, we could get a lot of bang for not that many bucks, put it that way.
Alex or Don, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I mean, I agree. It's not purely a money situation in terms of throwing cash at the system, especially depending on what the nature of the problem is. If it's still a problem of students living or trying to learn online, I think that needs money. We've got to get systems to them, broadband, and that's an infrastructure issue. I think if we've got students that need to be schools catching up, what we actually need is exactly what Michael's talking about, and that's an influx of really strong professional development for our teachers that they can use while working with students. So it can't be a one-off type of professional learning. It's got to be something that's going to last for the next 2 years to help work with their students. COVID's been impacting us for 2.5 years. Well, 2 years now. It's going to be for longer. It's going to take that long to fix it as well. So I think we've got to play the long game, and that is work with schools that have seen these real inequities surface, and then get some good teaching science behind them and working with those teachers to implement those kinds of structures to help their students succeed. We talked about resilience. I don't like that term, but children are able to learn, and they can learn effectively with good teaching. So I think it's really about solving that problem, making sure they get the best teaching possible in those situations. And it might look different than what they're used to. Probably, in fact, it will.
Okay.
Eva, I'll come in, I guess, from a slightly different angle. But first, not wanting people to walk away with the sense that, IFC were unscrupulous, capitalists, not at all. I think this issue of equity in education is front and center in our thinking. In all of our investments, without exception, they are, relatively speaking, accessible. Perhaps not to the very, very base of the pyramid, to the extent that we, the companies we support, charge tuition. But don't think of the institutions we support as sort of accessible only to the elite of a particular country. We strive and help these companies actually reach as far as they can down the pyramid. Look, I think we're all still learning about this. A little bit of the evidence that I've seen, studies done by the World Bank itself, I think the impact is significant. The past couple of years have not been kind to primary and secondary students all over the world. In my sense, that makes sense. The less resources a particular system had, the worse their kids have been hit. And I don't know, I mean, Dawn and Michael are the education experts. I come at this from a different point, but in my mind, you can't make up for lost time without investing more time. So there's no magic bullet that you can get these kids and just, do something and recoup the past couple of years, unless they stay, twice as long in school, which then for a number of other reasons is unlikely to happen. One area, and we might not be in full agreement, technology can help. I think short sometimes of being able to afford a private education, what we have seen in many of the countries we operate in is sort of remedial services, tutoring services that leverage technology and make that available to kids at scale. It's not an ideal solution by any stretch of the imagination, but to the extent that your kids are more or less forced to attend an underperforming system and you're short of alternatives, this is better than nothing. And I say this with caveats and reservation, but I think the gap that's been created these past couple of years will not magically disapprove. And I think the only way to address this is remedial services. And there, I think technology has a role to play.
So that's a good segue, because probably the second most common theme in the questions on Slido is about technology, and specifically about online learning, with one questioner controversially suggesting that with the disruptions, maybe we should just go completely online. Maybe not going that far, but it would be interesting to hear Michael and Don, because Alex has just talked about this, about what your views about technology, specifically online learning, and what's the role there.
Well, of course. Sorry, you go, Don.
Go ahead. I think it's an interesting one. I don't think online learning is a solution to all of our problems. I think it's a good technical resource. I think it has some real value. I think, let's talk about industry and what our industries need and what our commercial enterprises need. And I don't think we want a world where everybody's working online either. There's a real skill set. I mean, when we look at graduate profiles, what industries and businesses want from our graduates, it's communication skills, it's ability to work in groups and teams. I think online learning really struggles to create those kind of atmospheres to do that, again, especially for some groups of students. So I think we have to be careful on that. One thing that will be important is, as Alex said, it's going to take time to fix it. There's going to be a requirement for tertiary education and businesses to provide some of the opportunities for learning also now, how to work in these different kinds of environments as well. So, technology on its own won't solve it unless we have really good systems in place to help people integrate that into the everyday workplace and learning in higher ed.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think we have to distinguish between technology in general and, kids learning on Zoom or something. I think, Zoom, it's been a necessary evil. I mean, look at us. We're here today on Zoom. We probably couldn't have this conference without it. So it's certainly better than nothing. But I think it's one of the main reasons why we will see an exacerbation of inequality as a result of COVID. And I do not want to see my children or other children learning on Zoom or in these kinds of environments. Schools are social places, and we mustn't ever forget the huge importance of social learning. I feel immensely sorry for both the primary and secondary students who are at different stages of their social learning, and have had that badly disrupted. And I agree with Alex that we will not see the legacy of this disappear quickly. Unfortunately, it's going to be with us for a while. The worst thing we could do is carry on as if this was a good thing, because while some people, I think it goes to the whole experience of lockdown itself. There are people here in Wellington who have secure jobs in academia or the public service, sitting at home in their nice houses, working away quite comfortably. There are others in crowded accommodation, losing their jobs, losing their livelihoods, losing their minds, and it's no way to live, and it's no way to learn. So, but yes, technology can certainly help us. I mean, literacy as a technology has been with us for thousands of years, and a massively important one for education. So, of course, we should be looking at new technology and what it can offer us, but not at the expense of being together as people and the relationship that is absolutely at the heart of teaching and learning. So I don't want to see us perpetuate anything that comes from the COVID era. I want us to see us try to put it behind us. And as Alex said, it will take a while. I do think that if we focus hard on some of the things that we haven't been doing as well as we might, like, effective teaching based on the science of learning, if we started to really put that into place with gusto and enthusiasm, then we could catch up somewhat, because tragically for some time we have not been as effective as we could be by any means in some of the basics of education. So we could accelerate things if we started to do that.
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you, Michael. And you touched on the social fabric and the importance of the social fabric. And I want to switch gears a little bit and cover another important aspect of education that's come through on the Slido. And that's about the query is, what insights does the panel have on teachers' mental health and workload issues? And is there a crisis around losing teachers, which relates to the immigration panel from the Economics Forum? And then importantly, what are the solutions? So going to the staffing side of the equation. Alex, do you want to start? Or Don, go ahead. Go ahead.
Certainly, New Zealand, with its mandates, has certainly had a sudden loss of the teaching force due to the current mandates. I mean, it's an interesting profession. I think people that go into teaching learn, or the ones that survive learn early on. It's a stressful profession that takes a lot of time and effort. So, I think they're ready for that, and they've done well. Where the real struggles have come has certainly been, the uncertainty that comes across, as many of us have experienced, and having to then teach also both in online and in-person environments. I think that's challenging. I think of us have tried it, have really found that as well. And I think that extra additional time that teachers are facing. There's another hidden one that's out there, and you see this, again, we're a caring profession, to our strength and to our weakness at times. There's many, again, the research isn't great on this, but there's lots of anecdotal evidence of teachers spending time in the evenings with their students and trying to support them and families in crisis as well. So they're giving up their own health and well-being for their families to support other families in crisis. So I think this is where the unknowns are there, and we have to really watch for that. I think principals are doing a good job monitoring it, but many of us don't say much until it's too late.
I have a PhD student who's commencing a project on burnout in teachers, and she's been in schools for a while. She teaches yoga, actually, is one of her things, and so she's coming at it from a perspective of what can be done to mitigate, as Don says, what is intrinsically quite a stressful profession. I do think that there's been an issue for a long time, which has again been exacerbated by the COVID situation, of the amount of pressure that teachers work with. And while I think there is inevitably, because you're dealing with young people, inevitably there are social problems that come into your life that your students are having because of things that are happening in their households or in their communities. Those issues are hard to deal with by their nature. I'm not sure that we do enough to support teachers in what they're expected to do. I think schools are now, becoming more and more almost social work centres as well as educational centres. To an extent, perhaps they always have been, but, we're seeing schools feeding children who don't have breakfast, these kinds of things. And, these are good things to do, but we have to recognise the amount of pressure that puts on education workers and the extent to which burnout is a danger. And then we do lose people from the system. And that's terrible, because you lose experienced people, and it's terrible for them because, first of all, they lose their profession because they can't cope with it anymore. And also they've got a legacy of anxiety and depression to deal with. So I don't know what the answers are to this, but it's a problem that we need to recognise and try to grapple with.
Thank you, Michael. Alex, we have just a few minutes left, and I'm keen to hear your views on this topic.
So, and very, very briefly, look, and this is more anecdotal from the experience of some of the education institutions that we've invested in. So we monitor and talk to them often, right? And remember that we work in emerging markets, so countries with much more challenging environments than New Zealand or the US, Europe, etc. And I think that in these countries where there's virtually no safety nets, unfortunately, what we saw are schools closing because, if the teacher, him or herself, or somebody in the family is ill, or there's just no alternative, and so he or she cannot show up. That happens to a few people, the schools are closed. And we have seen, so again, anecdotal, but evidence, but schools in India shut down for months on end. And that's, as I said, that there's no, there's not, and connectivity is an issue. So as bad as the Zoom class that my kids had to sit through, that's not available. It's a real loss. I think it is a huge issue. In general, it is not, unfortunately, a profession that is better remunerated across the world, certainly in emerging markets. And in countries with very little safety net, not in a bad way, but the students pay the price because the school has to shut down.
Yeah, I just want to agree with what Alex is saying as well. I mean, I have worked in Pakistan and in Tanzania, and certainly in those areas, the challenges are so much greater for all those reasons. So all the problems we're talking about are even bigger there.
And so we end this conversation on the inequities that we started with COVID. And we've covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate and want to thank our panelists for their input and has given us lots to think about. So thank you very much. Back over to you, Matt.